My ex's sister needed a fake fiancé at her family wedding. Then the hotel gave us one bed. The first time I saw my ex-girlfriend after 3 years, she was standing beside her sister, smiling like the past had never happened. I almost turned around and walked out of the hotel. Then her sister grabbed my hand in front of the entire family and announced that I was her fiancé. The room went silent. Her mother dropped her glass. My ex stopped smiling. And I realized I had just agreed to become the fake fiancé of the one woman whose family had once blamed me for breaking their daughter's heart. What I didn't know was that by sunrise, that fake engagement would force me to confront the one truth I had spent 3 years running from. If you believe people deserve kindness, forgiveness, and second chances, take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories. 3 years earlier, I had believed I was going to marry Emily. We had met during college, fallen in love slowly, and built the kind of relationship that felt ordinary in the best possible way. We didn't have a perfect life, but we had plans. We talked about apartments, weekend trips, the kind of dog we'd eventually adopt, and whether our future kitchen should have an island. I thought those little conversations were proof that we were building something permanent. Then, one winter evening, Emily ended everything. There was no dramatic betrayal. No cheating. No screaming match. She simply told me that her family had never really accepted me and that she was tired of choosing between them and me. I begged her to reconsider. I told her we could work through it. She cried, I cried, and somehow the person I loved most became a stranger walking away from me. A week later, I moved to another city. I didn't hate Emily. That was the problem. It would have been easier if I hated her. Instead, I carried the memories with me. I worked, paid my bills, helped my younger brother through college, and slowly learned how to live without expecting her name to appear on my phone. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I received a message from Emily's younger sister, Sophie. She wanted to meet. I almost ignored it. But Sophie had always been kind to me, even when her family wasn't. So I agreed. She met me at a quiet cafe near my office. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her wedding was supposed to be that weekend, except there was one enormous problem. She wasn't getting married. Her family thought she was. Sophie explained that she had spent months pretending she was engaged to a man named Daniel because her parents had pressured her relentlessly about marriage. She had invented the relationship to buy herself time. But now her parents had arranged a huge family wedding celebration, invited relatives from across the country, booked an expensive hotel, and expected to finally meet her mysterious fiancé. Daniel didn't exist. Sophie had been planning to confess the truth. Then her mother suffered a frightening health scare. Sophie couldn't bring herself to break her mother's heart. She needed someone to pretend. I stared at her, convinced I had misunderstood. Then she said the words that made my stomach tighten. She wanted me to be her fake fiancé. I laughed at first because it sounded absurd. But Sophie wasn't laughing. She told me there was another reason she had chosen me. Her family already knew me. They remembered me as Emily's boyfriend. If she introduced a completely new man at the wedding, everyone would become suspicious. But if she said that she had quietly reconnected with me years later, it would at least sound believable. I should have said no. Every sensible part of me screamed no. But Sophie looked terrified. So I agreed. The wedding weekend began with a 3-hour drive to the hotel. Sophie spent most of the journey rehearsing details about our imaginary relationship, how we supposedly reconnected, where we supposedly went on dates, how I supposedly proposed. I couldn't help smiling at how ridiculous it was. But when we reached the hotel and walked into the grand lobby, my smile disappeared. Emily was there. She stood beside her mother near the staircase. Our eyes met. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then her gaze dropped to Sophie's hand resting on my arm. Something changed in her expression. I couldn't tell whether it was shock, sadness, or regret. Sophie immediately introduced me as her fiancé. The family reaction was explosive. Her father stared at me as if I had committed some crime. Her mother looked confused. Several relatives whispered among themselves. And Emily simply stood there, silent. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, I had been the boyfriend they didn't want. Now I was supposedly the fiancé they had to welcome. Dinner that night was uncomfortable. Everyone asked questions. Sophie had prepared answers, but I noticed Emily barely touched her food. Every time someone mentioned our imaginary relationship, she looked away. Then, just when I thought the evening couldn't become more awkward, the hotel manager approached us. There had been a booking error. Sophie's room had been accidentally assigned to another guest. The hotel was completely booked because of the wedding. The only room available was a suite with one bed. I stared at the manager. Sophie stared at me. Emily, standing several feet away, heard everything. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sophie quietly accepted the room. That night, we entered the suite and discovered the manager had not exaggerated. There was one enormous bed in the center of the room. I immediately grabbed a pillow and blanket. I told Sophie she could have the bed. I would sleep on the couch. She thanked me, but neither of us slept. Around midnight, Sophie finally admitted that she wasn't only afraid of her family. She was afraid of becoming like her mother. She had spent years watching her parents maintain a perfect marriage for everyone else while privately becoming strangers. Her mother cared more about appearances than happiness, and Sophie had convinced herself that marriage was simply something people endured to keep their families satisfied. She had invented Daniel because pretending to be loved was easier than admitting she was lonely. I listened quietly. Then she asked me why I had agreed to help. I told her the truth. Because someone once needed me to choose them, and I had been too hurt to understand what they were asking for. The room became quiet. She asked if I still loved Emily. I didn't answer immediately. Then I admitted that I didn't know. Maybe I loved who Emily had been. Maybe I loved the memories. Maybe part of me was still waiting for an apology that would never come. Sophie looked at me sadly and said that Emily had regretted the breakup almost immediately. I felt my chest tighten. She told me Emily had spent years believing I hated her. She had wanted to contact me many times but was too ashamed. I didn't know what to believe. The next morning, everything changed. During breakfast, Emily found me alone. She sat across from me. For the first time in 3 years, we were face to face without anyone else around. She didn't defend herself. She didn't blame her family. She simply apologized. She told me she had been young, scared, and desperate for approval. She had chosen the people who were loudest in her life instead of the person who had loved her quietly. She said losing me had taught her something painful. You can obey everyone around you and still end up completely alone. I didn't forgive her immediately. Forgiveness isn't a switch. Sometimes it's a door you slowly stop holding shut. The wedding ceremony began that afternoon. Sophie was supposed to walk into the ballroom beside me as her fake fiancé. But moments before we entered, she stopped. She looked at the hundreds of people waiting inside. Then she removed the fake engagement ring from her finger. She told me she couldn't do it anymore. Not because she was afraid. Because she finally understood that pretending to be someone else's idea of happiness was not happiness. Sophie walked into that ballroom alone. She stood before her family and told them the truth. There was no Daniel. There had never been a Daniel. She wasn't engaged. And she wasn't going to marry someone just to make everyone else comfortable. Her mother began crying. Her father became furious. Relatives whispered. But Sophie stood her ground. Then something unexpected happened. Her mother walked toward her. Instead of slapping her or shouting, she hugged her. She admitted that she had spent years forcing Sophie toward the life she thought would protect her, because she was terrified her daughter would make mistakes she couldn't undo. Sophie cried into her mother's shoulder. And for the first time that weekend, nobody was pretending. Later that evening, I found Emily outside the hotel. She told me she wasn't asking me to come back. She said she had finally learned that loving someone sometimes meant accepting that you had lost the right to ask them for another chance. That sentence stayed with me. Because it was the first time Emily had loved me without asking me for anything. I told her I didn't know what the future held. She smiled through tears and said she didn't either. Months passed. Sophie and I remained friends. The fake engagement became a strange family story everyone eventually laughed about. And Emily and I slowly began talking again. Not as boyfriend and girlfriend. Not as people trying to erase the past. Just two adults learning who they had become. One evening, nearly a year after that wedding, Emily and I sat in the same little cafe where Sophie had first asked me to help her. Emily placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. She looked nervous. Then she smiled and asked if I would like to go on a real date. No family. No pretending. No pressure. Just us. I looked at her for a long time. Then I smiled. And said yes. Not because the past had disappeared. It hadn't. Not because everything was suddenly perfect. It wasn't. I said yes because sometimes second chances aren't about returning to the people we used to be. They're about meeting again as the people we've finally become. The fake fiancé at a family wedding never expected to share a room with the past. He certainly never expected one hotel bed to become the place where old wounds finally began to heal. But sometimes life places you in the most uncomfortable room because it wants you to face what you've been avoiding. And sometimes the person who broke your heart isn't meant to return so you can repeat the story. They're meant to return so you can finally rewrite it. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope today. And before you go, comment, "I believe in second chances," if you believe that people can grow, change, and find their way back to love, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it. Because sometimes the most beautiful endings don't begin with a perfect love story. Sometimes they begin with 2 broken people sitting across from each other, finally telling the truth.